And when my wife introduced her college friend at our party, her sister pulled me aside. "That's the guy she's been seeing." I nodded, walked back, and said loud enough for everyone, "Nice to finally meet the guy she's been texting." Then things got interesting. My name is Nathan Cross, and I work as a fire inspector for the municipal fire department, which means I spend most of my days examining burn patterns in damaged buildings, documenting the progression of flames through structural materials, interviewing witnesses about what they saw and when they saw it, and reconstructing the sequence of events that led to a fire starting and spreading until it either burned itself out or was extinguished by responding firefighters. The job requires a particular kind of mindset, one that treats every scene as a puzzle to be solved through careful observation and methodical documentation. And over the years, I have learned that the truth about how a fire started is almost always visible in the physical evidence if you know how to read the patterns correctly, and if you resist the temptation to jump to conclusions before you have gathered all the available information. I approach my work with the same discipline that I was taught during my training at the Fire Academy, where instructors drilled into us the importance of treating every scene with the same systematic rigor, regardless of whether it was a minor kitchen fire or a major industrial blaze, because the methods and standards remain constant even when the scale and complexity change. My wife, Jess, works as a corporate event planner specializing in fundraising galas and professional networking events for nonprofits and business associations, and she has built a successful career by leveraging her natural charisma and her extensive network of contacts from her college years, when she was actively involved in the Alumni Association and served as chair of several committees that organized reunions and fundraising campaigns. She is the kind of person who thrives in social environments where she can work a room and make connections and position herself as someone who can solve problems and deliver results. And I have always admired her ability to navigate those professional spaces with confidence and ease, even though they are environments where I would feel uncomfortable and out of place. We have been married for 6 years, and for most of that time I believed we had a solid partnership built on mutual respect and complementary strengths, with me providing stability and careful planning, while she brought energy and social connections that opened doors and created opportunities for both of us. On the evening that everything changed, we were hosting a house party at our home to celebrate Jess being named chair of the Regional Alumni Network for her college, which was a significant professional accomplishment that would give her increased visibility and access to potential clients who attended alumni events and who might need event planning services for their own organizations. Jess had invited about 20 people to the party, including several members of the alumni board, some of her current clients, a few neighbors, and her younger sister Rachel, who worked as a marketing analyst and who had always been supportive of Jess's career, even though the two of them had very different personalities and approaches to professional life. I had spent the afternoon preparing food and setting up the main room of our house with extra seating and a drinks table, and by 7 o'clock in the evening, guests were beginning to arrive and Jess was in her element, greeting everyone warmly and introducing people to each other and creating the kind of welcoming atmosphere that made her so effective in her professional role. Around 7:15, after most of the guests had arrived and the party was in full swing with conversations happening in small clusters throughout the main room and kitchen, Jess called for everyone's attention and said she wanted to introduce someone special who had just arrived and who had been instrumental in helping her secure the alumni chair position. She gestured toward the doorway where a man in his early 40s stood holding a bottle of wine and smiling in a way that suggested he was completely comfortable being the center of attention, and Jess introduced him as Derek Callahan, describing him as a dear friend from college who had reconnected with her a few years ago and who had been serving as an informal mentor as she built her event planning business. Derek stepped into the room and shook hands with several people near him, and I watched from my position near the kitchen doorway as Jess touched his arm and laughed at something he said, and I noticed that there was a familiarity in their body language that went beyond what you would expect from old college friends who had reconnected professionally. I was processing this observation and trying to decide whether I was reading too much into a simple social interaction when I felt a hand on my elbow, and I turned to find Rachel standing next to me with an expression on her face that was somewhere between concern and anger. She leaned close so that no one else could hear and said in a low voice that barely qualified as a whisper, "That's not just her college friend, Nathan. That's the guy she's been seeing for months. I thought you knew and were okay with it. But your face right now tells me you had no idea." I felt something cold settle into my stomach as I processed what Rachel had just told me, and I looked across the room at Jess and Derek, who were now talking to a small group of guests and laughing together, and I saw the way she angled her body toward him and the way he maintained eye contact with her for just a fraction of a second longer than would be normal for a casual conversation between colleagues. I asked Rachel in a voice that was calmer than I felt how she knew this information and how long she had known it, and she said that she had been noticing inconsistencies in Jess's stories about where she was going and who she was meeting for about 4 months, and that she had started paying attention to social media tags and timestamps and other details that didn't match up with what Jess was telling family members at dinners and holiday gatherings. Rachel said she had confronted Jess about it 6 weeks ago and told her that she needed to either end the affair or tell me about it. And Jess had promised she would handle it, but clearly had not followed through, and Rachel said she could not in good conscience stand by and watch Jess bring her lover to a party in our home and introduce him to me as just a friend while I remained ignorant of the truth. I felt a surge of appreciation for Rachel's honesty mixed with anger at the situation and at the fact that this revelation was happening in the middle of a party with 20 guests in our home, and I realized that I had a choice to make about how to respond, and that whatever I did in the next few minutes would set the tone for everything that followed. I told Rachel to stay where she was, and I walked across the main room toward where Jess and Derek were standing with 3 other guests. And as I approached, I could hear Jess explaining some detail about an upcoming alumni fundraiser and Derek adding his thoughts about corporate sponsorship strategies. I positioned myself next to Jess and waited for a pause in the conversation, and when she turned to me with a smile and asked if I had met Derek yet, I looked directly at him and said in a voice that was loud enough to be heard by everyone in the immediate area, "Nice to finally meet the guy she's been texting." The words hung in the air for a moment, and I watched as Jess's smile froze on her face, and her complexion shifted from its normal healthy color to something pale and bloodless. And Derek's expression went from friendly confidence to confused alarm as he tried to process what I had just said, and whether it meant what he thought it meant. The conversations around us died away as people realized that something significant had just happened, and within seconds the entire room had gone quiet, with all 20 guests turning to look at the 3 of us standing in the center of the space. Jess recovered first and said with a forced laugh that I must be joking or confused, and she tried to redirect the conversation by introducing me to Derek properly and explaining that he was an old friend who had been helping her with professional networking. Derek attempted to play along by extending his hand for a handshake and saying something about how he had heard so much about me and was glad to finally meet in person. But I did not take his hand, and instead pulled my phone from my pocket and held it up so that the lock screen was visible to everyone standing nearby. And on that lock screen was a notification preview from a text message that Jess had received 3 days earlier from a contact labeled D-Work that said, "Can't wait to see you Friday, same hotel as last time." Several guests leaned in to see what was on my phone screen, and I watched as recognition and understanding spread across their faces, and Jess made a small sound that might have been a protest or might have been just an exhalation of breath as she realized that I had evidence and that her attempt to deny or deflect was not going to work. Derek's face flushed red, and he said that he thought it would be best if he left, and he started moving toward the front door without waiting for a response from anyone. And Jess followed him, saying that they needed to talk and that this was all a misunderstanding and that I was taking things out of context. I stepped aside to let them pass, and I did not try to block their exit or to continue the confrontation, and I watched as they both left through the front door and as Derek's car pulled away from the curb 30 seconds later, followed by Jess driving behind him. The remaining guests stood in uncomfortable silence for a moment, and then Rachel moved to my side and said in a voice that everyone could hear that she had tried to get Jess to end the affair and tell me the truth, but that Jess had refused to take responsibility for her choices. Several guests began gathering their belongings and making excuses about needing to leave early, and within 10 minutes the house was empty except for Rachel and me, and we stood in the main room surrounded by half-empty plates and wine glasses and the remnants of what was supposed to have been a celebration. Rachel apologized for not telling me sooner and for waiting until the party to say something, and I told her that I understood why she had hesitated and that I appreciated her finally giving me information that I clearly should have had months ago. After Rachel left, I spent an hour cleaning up the party debris and thinking about what had just happened and about what I should do next. And as I worked, I realized that my training as a fire inspector had given me exactly the skills I needed to approach this situation methodically and effectively. I understood how to document evidence, how to establish timelines, how to identify patterns in seemingly unrelated pieces of information, and how to build a case that would be impossible to dispute or explain away. I went to my car and retrieved my work laptop, and I sat down at the kitchen table and began creating a new folder labeled Evidence Documentation, with the same organizational structure I used for fire investigation reports. And I started by writing down everything I could remember about the past few months, including dates when Jess had claimed to be working late or attending conferences, and any details that had seemed slightly off or inconsistent at the time, but that I had rationalized away because I trusted her and had no reason to suspect she was lying. My phone vibrated continuously on the table beside me as Jess called and texted repeatedly, and I could see from the notification previews that she was demanding I call her back immediately and claiming that I had humiliated her in front of important professional contacts and that I owed her a chance to explain what was really happening, but I did not respond to any of the messages because I knew that anything I said at this point would only give her information about what I was thinking and what I planned to do next. I woke up the next morning after only a few hours of sleep, and I found that Jess had not come home during the night, which meant she had either stayed at a hotel or had gone to stay with a friend or possibly with Derek, though I suspected that Derek would have been trying to distance himself from the situation after the public exposure at the party, rather than providing her with comfort and support. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and began the process of systematically reviewing every piece of evidence I had been collecting over the past 2 weeks, because contrary to what Rachel and the party guests might have assumed, the lockscreen message preview I had shown at the party was not the first indication I had received that something was wrong in my marriage. It was simply the most recent addition to a growing file of suspicious details that I had been documenting with the same methodical approach I used when investigating the origin and cause of fires. The truth was that I had started noticing irregularities approximately 2 weeks before the party, when I had been using Jess's phone to look up a restaurant address because my own phone battery had died. And while I was typing into the browser, I had seen a notification appear on her lock screen from a contact labeled D-Work that said something about meeting at the usual place on Thursday evening. I had thought it was odd that a work contact would use language like the usual place, rather than specifying a location or providing professional context, and I had made a mental note to pay more attention to Jess's schedule and her explanations about where she was going and who she was meeting. Over the next 2 weeks, I had developed a habit of casually glancing at her phone whenever it was sitting on the kitchen counter or the bathroom vanity, and each time a notification appeared on the lock screen, I would photograph it with my own phone before the preview disappeared. And by the night of the party, I had collected 14 screenshots of message previews that painted a clear picture of an ongoing affair that involved regular meetups at hotels and restaurants and coordination of schedules to avoid detection. I opened the folder on my laptop where I had stored all 14 screenshots, and I began organizing them chronologically and adding notes about the context surrounding each message, including what Jess had told me she was doing on those particular dates and whether her stated plans matched up with the implications of the messages. The earliest screenshot was from 2 weeks ago and showed a message that said, "Tuesday works for me, same hotel downtown," and I cross-referenced that date with my own calendar and remembered that Jess had told me she was attending a networking dinner with potential clients that Tuesday evening and that she might be home late. The next screenshot was from 3 days after that and showed a message saying, "Last night was amazing. Can't stop thinking about you." And I noted that this message had arrived the morning after Jess's supposed networking dinner, which meant the dinner story had been a cover for meeting Derek at the hotel. I continued working through the screenshots methodically, and I noticed patterns in the timing and language that suggested the affair had been ongoing for significantly longer than 2 weeks, because the messages referenced usual places and, like last time, in ways that implied an established routine rather than a new relationship. I realized that the lock screen previews I had been capturing were just the visible surface of a much larger deception, and that if I wanted to understand the full scope and timeline of the affair, I would need to gather additional evidence from sources beyond Jess's phone messages. I pulled up our shared credit card statements online and began reviewing charges from the past 6 months, and I immediately noticed several hotel charges and restaurant bills that did not correspond with any events or trips that Jess had told me about, and when I looked more closely at the dates of these charges, I saw that they clustered around times when Jess had claimed to be attending professional conferences or working late on client projects. One charge in particular caught my attention, a hotel bill from 8 months ago for a property called the Grand Hotel that was located downtown, and that I knew had been the venue for a major alumni fundraising event that Jess had attended. She had told me at the time that she was going to the event with a group of girlfriends and that it was a girls' night situation, where they would all be celebrating the success of the fundraiser and probably staying out late, so I should not wait up for her. I had not thought anything of it at the time because Jess frequently attended alumni events, and I trusted her explanations about where she was going and who she was with. But now, as I looked at the credit card charge, I realized that our card had not been used for that particular hotel bill, which meant either Jess had paid cash or someone else had covered the cost, and the most likely explanation was that Derek had paid for a hotel room that night, and that the girls' night story had been a fabrication to cover an evening with him. I spent the next hour creating a detailed spreadsheet that listed every credit card charge from the past 8 months that seemed suspicious or that did not match up with Jess's stated activities, and I noted the date, amount, merchant name, and what Jess had told me she was doing on each of those dates. The spreadsheet revealed a clear pattern of hotel charges and restaurant bills that corresponded with evenings when Jess had claimed to be at work, events, or conferences, or meetings with clients, And when I mapped out these dates on a calendar, I could see that the affair had likely been active for at least 8 months and possibly longer. This timeline was significantly longer than I had initially suspected based on the lock screen messages alone, and it meant that Jess had been systematically lying to me and constructing elaborate cover stories for more than half a year while maintaining the appearance of a normal marriage and acting as though nothing was wrong. I heard my phone buzzing on the table, and I looked at the screen to see another series of text messages from Jess. And this time, instead of angry demands that I call her back, the messages had shifted to a more apologetic and pleading tone, with Jess saying that she knew she had made terrible mistakes and that she wanted a chance to explain everything and to talk about how we could work through this situation together. I read through the messages without responding, and I noticed that nowhere in any of her texts did she actually acknowledge the affair directly or admit to having a sexual relationship with Derek. Instead, she used vague language about mistakes and misunderstandings and things getting complicated, which told me that she was still trying to control the narrative and minimize her responsibility by leaving herself room to claim later that the affair was not as serious as it appeared, or that I had misinterpreted innocent interactions between colleagues. I opened a new document on my laptop and began drafting a timeline that integrated all the evidence I had collected so far, including the lock screen screenshots, the credit card charges, and my own observations about Jess's behavior and schedule over the past 8 months. I organized the timeline by month and included every piece of information I could verify through documentation, and I made sure to note which facts were supported by hard evidence like screenshots or credit card statements, and which were based on my memory of conversations or observations. As I worked on the timeline, I realized that I was approaching this exactly the way I would approach a complex fire investigation, where multiple potential ignition sources needed to be evaluated and ruled in or out based on the available evidence, and I found that this methodical analytical approach helped me stay focused and calm rather than getting overwhelmed by the emotional aspects of discovering that my wife had been cheating on me for most of the past year. Around noon, I received a phone call from Rachel, and when I answered, she asked how I was doing and whether I had heard from Jess since the party. I told Rachel that Jess had been texting and calling, but that I had not responded, and Rachel said that Jess had called her multiple times overnight claiming that I had overreacted and that the situation with Derek was not what it looked like, and that Rachel had betrayed her by saying something to me at the party. I asked Rachel if she would be willing to provide me with a written statement documenting what she had observed over the past several months regarding Jess's suspicious behavior and inconsistent stories, and Rachel agreed immediately and said that she had actually been keeping notes about Jess's alibis and cover stories because she had suspected something was wrong and wanted to have a record in case she ever needed to confront Jess or inform me about what was happening. Rachel explained that she had started paying close attention to Jess's activities about 4 months ago, after a family dinner where Jess had claimed she needed to leave early to attend a work event. But Rachel had later seen social media posts that showed Jess had actually been at a restaurant downtown with someone whose face was partially visible in the background of one photo. And when Rachel had zoomed in on the image, she had recognized Derek from previous alumni events where she had met him briefly. After that initial observation, Rachel had started cross-referencing what Jess told family members about her schedule against what was visible on social media through tagged locations and timestamps, and she had documented 6 separate occasions over 4 months where Jess's stated plans did not match her actual activities. Rachel said she had confronted Jess about these discrepancies 6 weeks before the party, and Jess had initially tried to deny that anything inappropriate was happening, but when Rachel pressed her and showed her the social media evidence, Jess had finally admitted that she had developed feelings for Derek and that they had been spending time together, but that it was not a full affair and that she was planning to end it soon because she did not want to damage her marriage or her professional reputation. I asked Rachel to send me her notes and any screenshots or documentation she had collected, and she said she would compile everything into a single document and email it to me by the end of the day. I thanked her for being willing to come forward with information and for not continuing to cover for Jess's behavior, and Rachel said that she loved her sister, but that she could not in good conscience enable lies and deception, especially when those lies were causing harm to someone who had always treated her with respect and kindness. After I ended the call with Rachel, I returned to my evidence documentation work, and I spent another 2 hours refining the timeline and adding notes about specific details that I wanted to verify or investigate further, and by mid-afternoon I had created a comprehensive document that laid out 8 months of suspicious activities, financial irregularities, and documented messages that collectively painted an undeniable picture of a sustained extramarital affair. I was reviewing the final version of the timeline when I heard a car pull into the driveway, and I looked out the window to see Jess getting out of her vehicle and walking toward the front door. She let herself in with her key and found me sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop open, and she stopped in the doorway and said that we needed to talk about what had happened at the party and about what I had said to Derek in front of all those people. I closed my laptop and looked at her without speaking, and after a moment of silence, she continued talking, saying that I had embarrassed her professionally and damaged her reputation within the alumni network, and that Derek was just a friend and mentor who had been helping her build her business, and that I had completely misinterpreted some text messages that were taken out of context. I listened to Jess's explanation without interrupting, and I maintained eye contact with her while she spoke, and I noticed that she was using the same techniques I had seen witnesses use during fire investigations when they were trying to minimize their involvement or responsibility for an incident, including vague language that avoided specific admissions, deflection that focused on my behavior rather than hers, and strategic framing that portrayed her relationship with Derek as purely professional despite the overwhelming evidence to the contrary. When she finally stopped talking and waited for me to respond, I opened my laptop and turned the screen toward her so she could see the spreadsheet I had created with 8 months of credit card charges highlighted in yellow, and I said in a calm voice that if Derek was just a professional mentor, then perhaps she could explain why our shared credit card showed multiple hotel and restaurant charges that corresponded exactly with evenings when she had claimed to be at work events or conferences. Jess looked at the spreadsheet, and her face went pale in the same way it had at the party when I had confronted her publicly, and she started to say something about how those charges were legitimate business expenses and that I was being paranoid and controlling by tracking her spending. But I held up my hand to stop her, and I told her that I was not interested in hearing more lies or explanations that contradicted documented facts. I pulled up the folder of lockscreen screenshots on my laptop, and I scrolled through all 14 images slowly so that she could see the dates and the content of the message previews, and I watched as her expression shifted from defensive anger to something that looked more like resignation or defeat as she realized that I had been systematically collecting evidence for 2 weeks, and that her attempt to deny or minimize the affair was not going to be effective because I had already built a case that she could not explain away. I told Jess that I wanted her to leave the house for the next few days while I decided how to proceed, and that we would not be having any extended conversations or negotiations until I had finished collecting all the evidence I needed and had consulted with an attorney about my options for legal separation. Jess protested and said that this was her home too, and that I could not just kick her out without giving her a chance to explain the full context of her relationship with Derek. And she said that if I would just listen to her side of the story, I would understand that things were more complicated than they appeared, and that she had never intended to hurt me or damage our marriage. I responded by telling her that she had already had 8 months to be honest with me about what was happening, and that she had chosen instead to lie repeatedly and to construct elaborate cover stories, and that I saw no reason to believe that anything she told me now would be more truthful than what she had been saying for the past 8 months. Jess changed tactics and started crying, and she said that she had made terrible mistakes, but that she loved me and wanted to save our marriage, and that Derek had pursued her aggressively and had taken advantage of her vulnerability during a stressful period in her career when she was feeling undervalued and overlooked. I recognized this as another deflection strategy where she was attempting to portray herself as a victim of Derek's manipulation rather than as an active participant in a consensual affair, and I told her that the message previews I had captured clearly showed her sending texts like "can't wait to see you" and "last night was amazing," which did not sound like the language of someone who was being pursued against her will, but rather like the language of someone who was enthusiastically engaged in a romantic relationship. Jess wiped her eyes and said that those messages were taken out of context and that I did not understand the full situation, and I responded by asking her to provide the full context by showing me the complete message threads on her phone so I could see what I was allegedly misunderstanding. She hesitated and said that she had deleted most of the messages because she knew the relationship with Derek was inappropriate and she had been planning to end it, and I pointed out that this claim about planning to end the affair contradicted her earlier claim that Derek was just a professional mentor and that there was no inappropriate relationship to end. Jess realized that she had contradicted herself, and she fell silent for a moment. And then she said that she needed time to think about everything and to figure out how to explain what had been happening in a way that I would understand. I told her that she could have all the time she needed to think, but that she would need to do that thinking somewhere other than our house, and that I expected her to pack a bag and leave within the next hour. Jess asked where she was supposed to go, and I suggested she could stay with Rachel or with one of her friends or at a hotel, and she said bitterly that Rachel had already made it clear whose side she was on, and that most of her friends had been at the party and had witnessed the confrontation, so she did not feel comfortable asking them for help. I told Jess that the consequences she was experiencing were the direct result of her own choices, and that I was not responsible for solving the problems she had created. And after another few minutes of ineffective protests, she went upstairs to the bedroom and began packing clothes into a suitcase. I stayed in the kitchen and continued working on my evidence documentation, and I heard her moving around upstairs for about 45 minutes before she came back down carrying a large suitcase and a bag with her laptop and other work materials. She stopped in the kitchen doorway and asked if I was really not going to give her any chance to explain or to work on our marriage, and I told her that I would consider discussing the situation after I had completed my evidence collection and had spoken with an attorney, but that I was not making any promises about reconciliation or forgiveness because I needed to fully understand the scope of her deception before I could make informed decisions about the future. Jess left without saying anything else, and I watched through the window as she loaded her bags into her car and backed out of the driveway. And once she was gone, I felt a strange sense of relief mixed with sadness. Relief that I would not have to maintain a facade of normalcy while living with someone who had been lying to me for months. But sadness that a relationship I had believed was solid and lasting had turned out to be built on deception and betrayal. I returned to my laptop and opened my email to find that Rachel had already sent me the document she had promised. A detailed file that included her handwritten notes from 4 months of observations, screenshots of social media posts that contradicted Jess's alibis, and a timeline that mapped out 6 specific occasions where Rachel had documented inconsistencies between what Jess claimed she was doing and what the evidence showed she had actually done. I spent the next 2 hours reviewing Rachel's documentation and integrating it into my own timeline, and I was impressed by how thorough and systematic her approach had been, with each entry including the date, what Jess had told family members she would be doing, what social media evidence showed she had actually done, and Rachel's notes about any suspicious details or inconsistencies she had observed. One entry from 3 months ago particularly stood out, where Rachel had documented that Jess had claimed she was attending a 2-day conference in a city 3 hours away, but Rachel had seen a social media check-in that showed Jess at a local restaurant downtown on the 2nd day of the supposed conference, and when Rachel had asked Jess about it at the next family dinner, Jess had claimed that the conference had ended early and she had decided to meet a client for lunch before driving home, even though the timestamp on the social media check-in was from the evening rather than lunchtime. I cross-referenced Rachel's timeline with my own credit card analysis and found multiple points where the 2 sources of evidence corroborated each other, which strengthened the overall case considerably because it meant I was not relying on a single source of information, but rather had multiple independent streams of evidence that all pointed to the same conclusion. I added notes to my timeline indicating where Rachel's observations confirmed or provided additional context for the credit card charges I had identified, and I began to see a clear pattern emerge where Jess had been more active with the affair during weeks when she knew I would be working night shifts or would be traveling for fire investigation training courses, which suggested that she had been strategically timing her meetings with Derek to minimize the risk of discovery. Around 6 in the evening, I received a text message from an unknown number, and when I opened it, I saw a message that said, "This is Elena Martinez. I'm a friend of Jess from college, and I think we need to talk about what's been happening. I have some information that you should probably know about." I was initially suspicious because I did not recognize the name, and I wondered if this might be someone reaching out on Jess's behalf to try to convince me to give her another chance. But I decided to respond and ask what information Elena wanted to share. She replied almost immediately, saying that she would prefer to talk by phone rather than through text messages, and she provided her phone number and asked if I would be willing to call her within the next hour. I waited about 30 minutes to give myself time to finish the work I was doing on the timeline, and then I called the number Elena had provided, and when she answered, she introduced herself as someone who had been Jess's roommate during their senior year of college and who had remained close friends with her over the years since graduation. Elena said that she had heard about the confrontation at the party from mutual friends who had been there, and that she felt she needed to reach out to me because she had been carrying guilt about staying silent regarding Jess's affair with Derek, which Elena had known about for approximately 3 months. I asked Elena how she had found out about the affair, and she explained that Jess had confided in her during a lunch meeting about 2.5 months ago, and that Elena had tried to convince Jess to end the affair immediately or to be honest with me about what was happening, but Jess had refused and had asked Elena to keep the information confidential. Elena said that she had been struggling with the ethical implications of staying silent and had been on the verge of reaching out to me several times over the past few months. But each time she had convinced herself that it was not her place to interfere in someone else's marriage and that Jess needed to make her own choices about how to handle the situation. However, after hearing about the public confrontation at the party and realizing that I had discovered the affair on my own without any warning or opportunity to prepare, Elena said she felt that she should have spoken up sooner and that she wanted to provide me with whatever information might be helpful as I tried to understand what had happened and why. I asked Elena if she would be willing to document what Jess had told her during their conversation 3 months ago, and Elena said she would write down everything she could remember and would also provide screenshots of text messages where she had warned Jess that the affair was dangerous and destructive. I thanked Elena for reaching out and for being willing to provide information, and I asked her if she had any insight into how long the affair had been going on, or how serious the relationship between Jess and Derek had become. Elena hesitated for a moment before answering, and then she said that based on what Jess had told her during their lunch conversation 3 months ago, the affair had been ongoing for at least 5 or 6 months at that point, which meant the total duration was probably close to 8 or 9 months by now. And Elena said that Jess had described the relationship with Derek as something that had started innocently as a professional mentorship, but had gradually evolved into something more personal and romantic over time. Elena also mentioned that Jess had been quite open about the fact that Derek had been instrumental in helping her secure several high-value clients by introducing her to people in his professional network who needed event planning services, and that this professional benefit had been one of the factors that made Jess reluctant to end the affair even though she knew it was wrong and damaging to her marriage. I asked Elena if Jess had mentioned anything specific about Derek's personal situation or whether he was married or in a relationship, and Elena said that Jess had mentioned in passing that Derek was married but that his marriage was apparently troubled and that he and his wife were allegedly living separate lives even though they remained together for financial and professional reasons. I made a note of this information because it suggested that Derek might have been misrepresenting his marital situation to Jess in order to make the affair seem more acceptable or less morally problematic. And I wondered whether Derek's wife knew about the affair, or whether she was in the same position I had been in until 2 weeks ago, completely unaware that her spouse was conducting a secret relationship behind her back. Elena continued talking and said that during their conversation 3 months ago she had tried to make Jess understand that the affair was not just a personal mistake but was also professionally risky because, if word got out within the alumni network or the event planning community that Jess was having an affair with someone who was steering clients to her business, it could damage her reputation and lead to accusations of conflicts of interest or ethical violations. Elena said that Jess had dismissed these concerns and had insisted that she and Derek were being extremely careful and that no one knew about their relationship except for Elena and one other friend who Jess had also confided in. And Jess had made Elena promise not to tell anyone because discovery would ruin everything she had worked so hard to build professionally. I asked Elena who the other friend was that Jess had confided in, and Elena provided the name of a woman named Harper, who worked in the same building where Jess had her event planning office and who apparently had been covering for Jess on several occasions, by claiming that she and Jess were working late together when in fact Jess had been meeting Derek. I wrote down Harper's name and made a note to try to contact her to see if she would be willing to provide information about what she knew and when she knew it, because having multiple witnesses who could corroborate the timeline and nature of the affair would make it much more difficult for Jess to claim later that the relationship had been innocent or brief or misunderstood. Elena said that she wanted to send me the text messages where she had warned Jess about the dangers of continuing the affair, and she asked for my email address so she could forward the screenshots along with a written statement describing what Jess had told her during their lunch conversation 3 months ago. I provided my email address and thanked Elena again for coming forward, and she said that she hoped the information would be helpful and that she was sorry I was going through such a difficult situation. And then we ended the call, and I returned to my work on the evidence timeline. About 20 minutes later, I received an email from Elena containing a PDF document with her written statement and 6 screenshots of text message conversations with Jess spanning from 3 months ago to just 2 weeks ago. I opened the PDF and began reading Elena's statement, which was detailed and specific and included direct quotes from what Jess had said during their lunch meeting about how the affair had started and how she felt about Derek and about me. According to Elena's account, Jess had described me as someone who was reliable and stable, but who lacked passion and excitement, and Jess had said that Derek made her feel valued and attractive and interesting in ways that I supposedly did not, and that being with Derek felt like an escape from the boring routine of her marriage. Reading Elena's description of what Jess had said about me was more painful than seeing the credit card charges or the message previews, because it revealed that Jess had not only been deceiving me about her activities, but had also been talking about me in disparaging terms to her friends and portraying our marriage as something that was unsatisfying and limiting rather than something she valued and wanted to preserve. I forced myself to continue reading through the entire statement, and I made notes about the specific details that Elena had documented, including the fact that Jess had admitted to meeting Derek at hotels approximately twice per month, and that they had developed routines and inside jokes and future plans that suggested the affair was not just physical, but also emotionally significant. The text message screenshots that Elena had included showed a progression of increasingly urgent warnings from Elena to Jess, starting with gentle suggestions 3 months ago that Jess should think carefully about what she was doing and consider the consequences for her marriage and her career, and escalating to more direct statements 2 months ago where Elena said explicitly that the affair needed to end immediately, and that Jess was playing with fire by continuing to see Derek while maintaining the pretense of a normal marriage. The most recent exchange from 2 weeks ago showed Elena asking Jess whether she had ended things with Derek yet, and Jess responding that she was planning to do it soon, but that the timing was complicated because Derek was helping her with a major client presentation, and she did not want to jeopardize that professional opportunity. I saved all of Elena's documentation to my evidence folder and updated my timeline to include the information she had provided, and I noted that her account corroborated the 8-month timeline that I had estimated based on the credit card analysis and Rachel's observations. I was now confident that I had a comprehensive and well-documented understanding of when the affair had started, how frequently Jess and Derek had been meeting, what kinds of cover stories Jess had been using, and who among Jess's friends and family had known about the situation, and this documentation would be essential when I met with an attorney to discuss legal separation and divorce proceedings. I spent the rest of the evening researching divorce attorneys in the area who specialized in cases involving adultery and marital asset division, and I compiled a list of 5 attorneys who had good reviews and who offered initial consultations where I could explain my situation and get advice about how to proceed. I scheduled consultation appointments with 3 of the attorneys for the following week, spacing them out over 3 days so that I would have time to compare their approaches and recommendations before deciding who to retain for formal representation. I also began creating an inventory of all our shared assets, including the house, our cars, our retirement accounts, and various personal property items, because I knew that divorce proceedings would require a detailed accounting of everything we owned jointly, and that having this information organized in advance would make the process more efficient. Around 10 o'clock that evening, I received another series of text messages from Jess, and this time her tone had shifted from apologetic to angry, with messages saying that she had spoken with some of her friends who were attorneys, and they had told her that I had no legal right to force her out of the house and that she could return whenever she wanted because her name was on the deed and the mortgage. I did not respond to these messages because I knew that engaging in a text argument would be counterproductive and would only give Jess information about my legal strategy, and I made a note to discuss with my attorney whether there were any steps I needed to take to protect my interests while we were living separately but before formal divorce proceedings had been initiated. The next morning, I drove to my office at the fire station and tried to focus on my regular work responsibilities, reviewing reports from recent fire inspections and preparing for an upcoming court appearance where I would be testifying as an expert witness about the cause of a warehouse fire that had occurred 6 months earlier. I found it difficult to concentrate on the technical details of burn patterns and ignition sources when my personal life was in such turmoil, but I forced myself to work through the material systematically because I knew that maintaining my professional reputation and performance was essential regardless of what was happening in my marriage. During my lunch break, I received a phone call from a number I did not recognize, and when I answered, a woman's voice said, "Is this Nathan Cross?" And when I confirmed that it was, she introduced herself as Claire Donovan and said that she was Derek Callahan's wife, and that she needed to speak with me about the situation between our respective spouses. I felt a jolt of surprise because I had been planning to try to locate and contact Derek's wife myself, but apparently she had found me first, probably through the same alumni network gossip channels that had spread news of the party confrontation so quickly. Claire said that she had heard about what happened at the party from multiple sources, and that when she had confronted Derek about it, he had initially tried to deny that anything inappropriate was happening with Jess, but after Claire pressed him and told him that she had already heard detailed accounts from people who were at the party, Derek had admitted that he had been having what he called a brief involvement with Jess, but claimed it was already over and had not been serious. Claire said that she did not believe Derek's characterization of the affair as brief or insignificant, and she wanted to compare notes with me about what evidence I had collected and what timeline I had established, because she suspected that Derek had been lying to her about the duration and nature of his relationship with Jess in the same way that Jess had presumably been lying to me. I asked Claire if she would be willing to meet in person to discuss what we both knew, and she agreed immediately and suggested that we meet that afternoon at a coffee shop that was located roughly halfway between her workplace and the fire station. I told her I could be there by 3 o'clock, and she said that would work for her schedule, and we agreed to exchange phone numbers so we could find each other at the coffee shop. I spent the early afternoon finishing up my work tasks and organizing my thoughts about what information I wanted to share with Claire, and what questions I wanted to ask her about Derek's behavior and schedule over the past 8 months. I arrived at the coffee shop a few minutes before 3 and found a table in a quiet corner where we would be able to talk without being easily overheard by other customers, and I ordered a coffee and waited for Claire to arrive. She walked in right at 3 o'clock, and I recognized her immediately from the description she had given me over the phone, a woman in her early 40s with dark hair and professional business attire who looked tired and stressed in the way that I imagined I probably looked as well. We shook hands, and she sat down across from me, and after a moment of awkward silence where neither of us seemed to know quite how to begin this unusual conversation, Claire said that she appreciated my willingness to meet with her and that she hoped we could work together to get a clear picture of what had actually been happening between Derek and Jess. I pulled out my laptop and opened the evidence folder I had been compiling, and I showed Claire the timeline document that laid out 8 months of credit card charges, lockscreen message previews, and witness statements from Rachel and Elena, and as she reviewed the material, I watched her face shift through a series of emotions, including shock, anger, and what looked like bitter recognition, as she realized that the pattern of deception I was describing matched exactly with irregularities she had noticed in Derek's behavior and schedule over the same time period. Claire said that she had suspected something was wrong for several months, but had not been able to identify what exactly was happening, and she had attributed Derek's distracted behavior and frequent late nights to work stress and to the demands of his procurement consulting business, which often required him to travel to meet with clients and vendors in different cities. Claire opened her own laptop and pulled up a calendar application where she had been tracking Derek's claimed business trips and late work nights. And when we placed her calendar next to my timeline, we immediately saw that Derek's supposed business travel dates corresponded almost perfectly with the hotel charges on my credit card statement, and with the dates when Jess had claimed to be attending conferences or working late on client projects. Claire pointed to one entry from 5 months ago where Derek had told her he needed to attend a 3-day vendor conference in a city 2 hours away, and I showed her a hotel charge from that same weekend at a property that was located downtown in our own city, not 2 hours away. And we both realized that Derek and Jess had fabricated parallel cover stories that allowed them to spend an entire weekend together, while their respective spouses believed they were in different locations for legitimate professional reasons. I asked Claire when she had first started to suspect that something was wrong, and she said that the initial warning sign had come about 4 months ago when she had noticed that Derek was being unusually protective of his phone and would take it with him into the bathroom or keep it face down on the table during meals, which was a change from his previous behavior of leaving his phone casually around the house without any apparent concern about who might see his messages or notifications. Claire said she had also noticed that Derek had started going to the gym more frequently and had purchased new clothes and had generally seemed more concerned with his appearance than he had been in previous years. And while these changes could have been innocent self-improvement efforts, in retrospect they fit the pattern of someone who was trying to make themselves more attractive for a new romantic interest. Claire told me that she had tried to talk to Derek about whether something was wrong in their marriage or whether he was feeling stressed or unhappy, and he had assured her that everything was fine and that he was just going through a busy period at work and was trying to stay healthy and manage stress through exercise and self-care. She said she had wanted to believe him because they had been married for 14 years and had built what she thought was a solid partnership, and the idea that he might be having an affair had seemed so unlikely and so contrary to the person she thought she knew that she had dismissed her suspicions as paranoia or insecurity. Claire's voice became tight with emotion as she described how she had actually apologized to Derek for being suspicious and had told herself that she needed to be more trusting and supportive. And now she realized that her instincts had been correct all along and that Derek had been lying to her face while she blamed herself for doubting him. I shared with Claire the information that Elena had provided about Jess claiming that Derek's marriage was troubled and that he and Claire were living separate lives. And Claire's expression hardened as she heard this because it confirmed that Derek had been actively misrepresenting their relationship to Jess in order to make the affair seem more acceptable or less morally problematic. Claire said that their marriage had certainly had its challenges like any long-term relationship, but that they were not living separate lives and that Derek had never expressed any desire to separate or divorce. And in fact, just 3 months ago they had been discussing plans to renovate their house and had been looking at contractors and design options, which was not the behavior of someone who was planning to leave his marriage. I asked Claire what she wanted to accomplish by meeting with me and sharing information, and she said that her primary goal was to understand the full truth about what had been happening so that she could make informed decisions about her own marriage and her future. But she also said that she believed Derek and Jess should face consequences for their deception and that she was tired of being lied to and manipulated by someone she had trusted for 14 years. Claire mentioned that Derek held a significant amount of professional power within the corporate charity and nonprofit community because his procurement consulting firm controlled vendor relationships and sponsorship decisions for several major organizations, and she said that if it became known that Derek had been having an affair with an event planner whose business benefited directly from his vendor recommendations and client introductions, it would raise serious questions about conflicts of interest and ethical violations that could damage his professional reputation and potentially cost him clients. I told Claire about my plan to consult with divorce attorneys the following week, and I asked her if she had considered taking similar steps to protect her own interests, and she said that she had already contacted an attorney the day after the party when she first heard about the confrontation, and her attorney had advised her to start documenting everything she could about Derek's activities, finances, and business relationships, before informing him that she was considering divorce. Claire said that her attorney had also suggested that she should be strategic about when and how she confronted Derek with evidence of the affair, because once Derek knew that she had documentation of his activities, he would likely become defensive and might try to hide assets or destroy evidence or otherwise take steps to protect himself in anticipation of divorce proceedings. We spent the next hour comparing our evidence in detail and identifying gaps where we needed additional documentation or corroboration from other sources, and we discussed the possibility of reaching out to Harper, the friend who had been covering for Jess by claiming they were working late together when Jess was actually meeting Derek. Claire suggested that Harper might be more willing to cooperate and provide information if the request came from both of us together rather than from just one betrayed spouse, because Harper would realize that the affair was now known to multiple people and that trying to continue covering for Jess would be pointless and potentially damaging to Harper's own reputation. I agreed with Claire's suggestion, and I said I would try to find contact information for Harper and reach out to her in the next few days, and Claire offered to help with that process because she had connections through Derek's professional network that might make it easier to locate Harper's phone number or email address. We also discussed the upcoming charity gala that was scheduled to take place in 3 weeks, which was a major annual fundraising event that Derek was heavily involved in organizing and that Jess had been planning to attend as part of her role as chair of the alumni network. And Claire said that she was debating whether to attend the gala herself as a way of making a public statement that she was aware of Derek's affair and was not going to quietly disappear or pretend that everything was fine. I told Claire that I thought attending the gala could be a powerful move, but that it would also be emotionally difficult and would potentially create a very uncomfortable public situation, and I suggested that if she did decide to attend, she should think carefully about what she wanted to accomplish and what kind of statement she wanted to make. Claire nodded and said she was still weighing her options, but that she was leaning toward attending because she felt that Derek and Jess had been operating in secret for too long, and that bringing their affair into the open in a setting where many of their professional colleagues and social contacts would be present might be the most effective way to ensure that there were real consequences for their behavior. As our conversation was winding down, Claire said something that caught me off guard, which was that she had been doing some research into the charity organization that was hosting the gala and had discovered that Derek's role as procurement consultant gave him significant influence over which vendors were hired for events and which businesses received recommendations for catering, floral arrangements, audiovisual services, and other event-related contracts. Claire said that if Derek had been steering business to Jess's event planning company as a form of compensation or reward for their affair, that would constitute a serious conflict of interest that violated the charity's ethics policies and potentially violated professional standards in the procurement field, and that the charity's board of directors would need to be informed about the situation so they could investigate and take appropriate action. I asked Claire if she was planning to report Derek's conduct to the charity board, and she said she was strongly considering it, but wanted to make sure she had solid documentation before making such a serious allegation, because once she filed a formal complaint, it would become a matter of institutional record and would likely result in an investigation that could have significant professional consequences for both Derek and Jess. I told Claire that I supported her decision to report the conflict of interest if the evidence supported such a claim, and I offered to share any documentation I had that might be relevant to establishing a pattern of professional favoritism or preferential treatment. We exchanged contact information and agreed to stay in regular communication as we both moved forward with divorce proceedings and evidence collection. And Claire said that she felt a sense of relief at being able to talk openly with someone who understood what she was going through and who was not going to judge her or tell her that she should try to save her marriage or give Derek another chance. I told Claire that I felt the same way and that I appreciated her willingness to share information and to work collaboratively rather than viewing each other as adversaries or complications in an already difficult situation. After Claire left the coffee shop, I sat alone for a few more minutes processing everything we had discussed, and I realized that the affair between Jess and Derek was significantly more complex and more professionally entangled than I had initially understood, and that the consequences for both of them could extend well beyond the personal damage to their marriages, and could potentially affect their careers and their reputations within their respective professional communities. I also realized that Claire was a natural ally in this situation because we both had access to different pieces of the overall puzzle, and because we both had a shared interest in uncovering the full truth and ensuring that Derek and Jess faced appropriate consequences for their sustained deception. I drove back to my house and spent the evening updating my evidence timeline to incorporate the information that Claire had provided, and I created a new section in my documentation that focused specifically on the professional conflict of interest angle and the question of whether Derek had been using his procurement authority to benefit Jess's business in exchange for their romantic relationship. I pulled up the websites for several of the charities and nonprofit organizations that Derek worked with, and I began researching their ethics policies and vendor selection procedures to understand what rules and standards might have been violated by Derek's conduct. Around 9 o'clock that evening, I received an email from Rachel containing additional information that she had remembered since sending her initial documentation, including details about a family holiday gathering from 6 months ago where Jess had claimed she needed to leave early to handle an event planning emergency for a client. But Rachel had later seen social media posts from other family members showing that Jess had actually left to meet Derek at a restaurant downtown. Rachel's email included screenshots of the social media posts with timestamps that proved Jess's emergency excuse had been fabricated, and Rachel also mentioned that she had recently remembered another occasion from about 7 months ago where Jess had asked Rachel to lie to me about Jess's whereabouts, claiming that she needed an alibi because she was planning a surprise for my birthday. But when my birthday came and went without any surprise, Rachel had realized that Jess had used her as an unwitting accomplice in covering for a meeting with Derek. I read through Rachel's email carefully and added the new information to my evidence timeline, and I noted that the incident where Jess had asked Rachel to provide a false alibi under the pretense of planning a birthday surprise was particularly significant because it demonstrated premeditation and strategic planning rather than impulsive behavior, and it showed that Jess had been willing to manipulate even her own sister and to exploit Rachel's trust and affection in order to facilitate her affair with Derek. I replied to Rachel's email thanking her for the additional information and asking if she would be comfortable speaking with Claire, Derek's wife, who was also collecting evidence and who might benefit from hearing Rachel's observations about the timeline and pattern of deception that Jess had maintained over the past 8 months. Rachel responded within minutes, saying that she would be willing to speak with Claire and that she felt it was important for both of us to have as complete a picture as possible of what Jess and Derek had been doing. And Rachel also mentioned that she had been receiving increasingly angry and desperate text messages from Jess, accusing her of ruining Jess's life and destroying the relationship between the two sisters, and that Jess had been trying to convince Rachel that I was being controlling and abusive, and that Rachel had been manipulated into taking my side against her own family. I asked Rachel if she was feeling pressured or uncertain about her decision to come forward with information, and Rachel replied that she was completely confident in her choice and that Jess's attempts to manipulate her through guilt and accusations only reinforced Rachel's belief that she had done the right thing by telling me the truth at the party. The following day, I had my first consultation appointment with a divorce attorney named Michael Reynolds, who specialized in cases involving adultery and complex asset division, and I brought my laptop and all of my evidence documentation to his office, and I spent 90 minutes walking him through the complete timeline of the affair, the credit card charges, the witness statements from Rachel and Elena, the lockscreen message screenshots, and the information I had gathered from my conversation with Claire about Derek's professional position and the potential conflict of interest implications. Michael listened carefully and took detailed notes, and when I finished presenting all the evidence, he sat back in his chair and said that, in his 20 years of practicing family law, he had rarely seen a case where a spouse had documented an affair so thoroughly and systematically before initiating divorce proceedings, and that the quality and quantity of evidence I had compiled would make it very difficult for Jess to contest the grounds for divorce or to claim that the affair was insignificant or that I was exaggerating the situation. Michael explained that in our state, adultery was one of the fault-based grounds for divorce that could affect the division of marital assets and could potentially result in a more favorable settlement for the wronged spouse, particularly if the adultery could be shown to have involved the dissipation of marital assets or if the cheating spouse had used marital funds to support the affair through hotel charges, gifts, or other expenditures. He said that based on the credit card evidence I had shown him, there was a clear case to be made that Jess had used our shared credit card for some affair-related expenses, although the amounts were relatively modest and probably would not result in a major shift in asset division, but the documented evidence of the affair itself would certainly strengthen my position in negotiations and would make it less likely that Jess could successfully claim entitlement to spousal support or to a larger share of marital property. I asked Michael about the timeline for divorce proceedings and what steps I should be taking immediately to protect my interests, and he said that the first formal step would be to file a petition for divorce with the court, which would include a statement of the grounds for divorce and a proposed division of assets and liabilities, and that once the petition was filed, Jess would have a specified period of time to file a response, either accepting the proposed terms or contesting them and offering alternative proposals. Michael said that before filing the petition, he would recommend that I complete a comprehensive inventory of all marital assets, including bank accounts, retirement accounts, real estate, vehicles, and personal property, and that I should also gather documentation of all marital debts, including mortgages, car loans, credit card balances, and any other obligations that would need to be addressed in the divorce settlement. Michael also advised me to avoid any actions that could be characterized as vindictive or punitive toward Jess, such as cutting off her access to bank accounts or credit cards without court authorization, or preventing her from entering the marital home, or making disparaging statements about her to mutual friends or professional contacts, because such actions could potentially be used against me in divorce proceedings to argue that I was being unreasonable or controlling. He said that the best strategy was to maintain a calm and businesslike approach to the divorce process, to focus on documenting facts and protecting my legal interests rather than on punishing Jess or seeking revenge, and to let the evidence speak for itself rather than engaging in emotional confrontations or public arguments. I told Michael that I had been approached by Derek's wife Claire and that we had been comparing evidence and discussing the possibility of coordinating our approaches to the respective divorces. And Michael said that while there was nothing illegal or improper about sharing information with Claire, I should be careful not to create the impression that I was conspiring with her to harm Jess and Derek, or that I was coordinating testimony or evidence in a way that might appear to be collusion. He suggested that if Claire and I were going to continue sharing information, we should each document our conversations and be prepared to explain to the court, if necessary, why we had chosen to communicate with each other and what information we had exchanged. After my consultation with Michael, I drove to the fire station and tried to focus on my regular work duties, but I found myself constantly thinking about the divorce process and about what the next few months were likely to involve in terms of legal filings, negotiations, and potentially contentious interactions with Jess. I received a text message from Claire around midday asking if I had made progress on finding contact information for Harper, the friend who had been covering for Jess by claiming they were working late together, and I replied that I had not yet had time to search for Harper's contact information, but that I would try to do so within the next day or two. That evening, I spent several hours creating a detailed inventory of all marital assets using bank statements, property records, vehicle registration documents, and retirement account statements. And as I worked through this process, I was struck by how much financial documentation Jess and I had accumulated over 6 years of marriage, and how complicated it would be to untangle all of these shared accounts and jointly owned properties. I noted that the house we lived in had been purchased with funds from both of our savings accounts and had appreciated significantly in value since we bought it 4 years ago, and that dividing the equity in the house would likely be one of the more complex and potentially contentious aspects of the divorce settlement. I also reviewed our retirement accounts and noted that I had significantly more saved than Jess did because I had been contributing consistently to my account since starting my job with the fire department 12 years ago, while Jess had only started contributing to her retirement account about 8 years ago when she launched her event planning business, and her contributions had been irregular because her income as a self-employed business owner fluctuated considerably from year to year. I knew that retirement accounts were typically considered marital property subject to division in divorce proceedings, but I hoped that Michael would be able to negotiate an agreement that took into account the fact that much of my retirement savings had been accumulated before our marriage, and that Jess's affair provided grounds for a more favorable settlement on my behalf. Around 10 o'clock that evening, I finally located contact information for Harper through a professional networking website where she had a profile listing her current position at a marketing firm, and I sent her a brief message explaining who I was and saying that I needed to speak with her about information she might have regarding Jess's activities over the past several months, and I included my phone number and asked her to call me when she had a chance to talk privately. I did not mention Derek or Claire or the specific nature of what I wanted to discuss, because I did not want to give Harper advance warning that would allow her to coordinate a story with Jess or to refuse to speak with me. The next morning, I received a phone call from Harper, who sounded nervous and hesitant as she introduced herself and said that she had received my message and wanted to know what this was about. I explained in a calm and non-accusatory tone that I had discovered that Jess had been having an affair with Derek Callahan for approximately 8 months, and that during my investigation I had learned from multiple sources that Harper had been providing alibis for Jess by claiming that they were working late together when in fact Jess had been meeting Derek. I told Harper that I was not angry with her and was not planning to take any action against her, but that I needed accurate information about what she knew and when she knew it in order to establish a complete timeline of the affair for divorce proceedings. Harper was quiet for a long moment after I finished speaking, and then she said in a voice that was barely above a whisper that she had been dreading this conversation for months and had known that eventually the affair would be discovered and that she would have to answer questions about her role in helping Jess hide it. Harper said that Jess had first asked her to provide a cover story about 4 months ago, claiming that she needed an alibi because she was planning a surprise for me and did not want me to find out about her plans, and Harper had agreed without thinking too much about it because she trusted Jess and assumed the request was innocent. However, Harper continued, after providing that first alibi, she had started to suspect that something else was going on because Jess had asked her to cover for her on several additional occasions over the following weeks, always with vague explanations about work emergencies or client meetings that ran late, and eventually Harper had confronted Jess directly and asked if she was having an affair. Harper said that Jess had initially denied it, but then had broken down and admitted that she was seeing Derek and that the relationship had become serious and emotionally important to her, and Jess had begged Harper to continue providing alibis and to keep the affair secret because if it became public, it would destroy her marriage and damage her professional reputation within the alumni network and the event planning community. I asked Harper why she had agreed to continue covering for Jess after learning that the alibis were being used to facilitate an affair rather than to plan a surprise, and Harper said that she had felt trapped by her initial agreement to help and had worried that if she refused to continue providing cover stories, Jess would be angry with her and might retaliate by damaging Harper's professional relationships or spreading negative information about her within their shared business community. Harper also said that Jess had been emotionally manipulative during their conversations about the affair, crying and saying that she was in love with Derek and that she had never felt this way about anyone before and that Harper was the only friend she could trust with the truth, and that these emotional appeals had made it difficult for Harper to maintain firm boundaries or to refuse Jess's requests for help. I asked Harper if she would be willing to provide a written statement describing what Jess had told her about the affair and documenting the specific occasions when Harper had provided alibis or cover stories, and Harper hesitated and said that she was worried about the consequences of putting this information in writing because it might affect her friendship with Jess or might somehow be used against her professionally. I told Harper that I understood her concerns about potential consequences, but I also explained that her written statement would be important for establishing the truth about what had been happening and for ensuring that the divorce proceedings were based on accurate information rather than on competing narratives where Jess might try to minimize or deny the extent of the affair. I also mentioned that Claire, Derek's wife, was collecting similar evidence and documentation, and that if Harper refused to provide a statement to me, she might end up being contacted by Claire or by attorneys representing one of the parties in the divorce cases, and that it would be better to provide the information voluntarily now rather than being compelled to testify later through formal legal processes. Harper was quiet for another long moment, and then she said that she would think about it and would let me know within the next day or two whether she was willing to provide a written statement, and she asked if she could speak with Jess first to let her know that I had contacted her and that the situation was becoming more complicated. I told Harper that I could not prevent her from speaking with Jess, but I strongly advised against it because Jess would likely try to convince her to refuse to cooperate or to provide a sanitized version of events that minimized the affair. And I said that if Harper genuinely wanted to do the right thing and tell the truth about what had happened, she should provide her statement without consulting Jess first and should base her account on what she actually knew and observed rather than on what Jess might want her to say. Harper said she understood my point and would think carefully about how to proceed. And then we ended the call, and I made detailed notes about our conversation, including the key facts she had disclosed about when Jess first asked her for an alibi, and about Jess's admission that the relationship with Derek had become serious and emotionally important. I forwarded my notes to Claire via email so that she would be aware that I had made contact with Harper and that Harper had confirmed her role in providing cover stories for Jess, and Claire responded within an hour saying that she thought we should try to meet with Harper in person together, because seeing both of us at once might make Harper realize that the affair had caused damage to multiple people and might make her more willing to cooperate fully and honestly. I thought Claire's suggestion was strategically sound, so I called Harper back and proposed that she meet with both me and Claire for a brief conversation where we could explain what we knew and what we were trying to accomplish, and Harper reluctantly agreed and suggested that we meet the following afternoon at a park near her workplace where we could talk without being overheard or interrupted. I confirmed the meeting time and location with Harper, and then sent Claire a text message with the details, and Claire replied saying that she would be there and that she appreciated my willingness to coordinate this conversation with Harper, rather than approaching her separately in ways that might have seemed more adversarial or threatening. The next afternoon, I arrived at the park about 10 minutes early and found Claire already waiting at a picnic table near the walking path, and we spent a few minutes discussing how we wanted to approach the conversation with Harper, and agreeing that we would take turns asking questions and would try to maintain a calm and non-confrontational tone even if Harper became defensive or tried to minimize her role in enabling the affair. Harper arrived right on time, looking anxious and uncomfortable, and she sat down across from Claire and me with her arms crossed and her body language suggesting that she was prepared for an unpleasant conversation. Claire began by introducing herself and explaining that she was Derek's wife and that she had been married to him for 14 years and had been completely unaware of his affair with Jess until the confrontation at the party had made the relationship public knowledge. And she said that she was trying to understand the full scope of what had been happening and how long it had been going on so that she could make informed decisions about her marriage and her future. I followed by thanking Harper for agreeing to meet with us and by reiterating that we were not trying to threaten her or to cause problems for her professionally, but that we needed accurate information from someone who had been in a position to observe the affair firsthand and who could corroborate the timeline and nature of the relationship between Jess and Derek. Harper looked back and forth between Claire and me, and then she said that she wanted to be honest with us, but that she also felt terrible about the role she had played in helping Jess hide the affair, and that she had lost sleep over the past few months, worrying about what would happen when the truth eventually came out. Harper said that the first time Jess had asked her to provide an alibi was approximately 4 months ago, which was consistent with the timeline I had established through other evidence, and that Jess had called her on a Thursday afternoon and asked if Harper would tell me that she and Jess were working late together on a client proposal if I happened to ask where Jess was that evening. Harper said that at the time she had not thought the request was suspicious because she and Jess did occasionally work late together on projects, and she had assumed that Jess had some personal errand or appointment that she did not want to explain to me for whatever reason, and it had not occurred to Harper that Jess might be using her as a cover story for an affair. However, Harper continued, over the next few weeks, Jess had made similar requests on 3 or 4 more occasions, and the pattern had become obvious enough that Harper had started to suspect that something more serious was going on. And when she finally confronted Jess directly and asked if she was seeing someone, Jess had broken down and admitted that she had been having an affair with Derek for several months and that she was in love with him and did not know what to do about the situation. Claire asked Harper what specific details Jess had shared about the affair during that conversation, and Harper said that Jess had described Derek as someone who made her feel valued and appreciated in ways that I supposedly did not, and that Jess had complained that I was too focused on my work and too emotionally distant, and that our marriage had become routine and boring. Harper also said that Jess had talked about how Derek was helping her professionally by introducing her to potential clients and by giving her advice about how to grow her event planning business, and that Jess seemed to view the professional benefits of the relationship as partial justification for continuing the affair despite knowing it was wrong. I asked Harper if Jess had ever mentioned anything about planning to leave me or to end her marriage in order to be with Derek, and Harper said that Jess had been inconsistent and contradictory on that point, sometimes saying that she wanted to divorce me and build a life with Derek, but other times saying that she could not afford to get divorced because it would damage her professional reputation and would complicate her financial situation. Harper said that she had gotten the impression that Jess was trying to have it both ways, maintaining her marriage to me for the stability and respectability it provided, while also continuing her relationship with Derek for the excitement and professional benefits it offered, and that Jess had not seriously thought through the long-term sustainability or ethical implications of this arrangement. Claire asked Harper if she had ever met Derek or had any direct conversations with him about the affair, and Harper said that she had met him briefly at one alumni event about 3 months ago where Jess had introduced them, but that they had not discussed the affair, and Harper did not think Derek knew that she was aware of his relationship with Jess. Harper added that during that brief meeting she had observed Derek and Jess together and had noticed that they had a familiarity and ease with each other that went beyond what you would expect from professional colleagues, and that she had seen them touching each other's arms and maintaining prolonged eye contact in ways that suggested romantic involvement. I asked Harper if she would be willing to document everything she had just told us in a written statement that we could use as evidence in our respective divorce proceedings, and Harper hesitated and said that she was still worried about the consequences of putting this information in writing, particularly because she worked in the same professional building as Jess and saw her regularly and was concerned about creating ongoing tension or hostility in their working relationship. Claire responded by saying gently but firmly that Harper needed to understand that by providing alibis and cover stories for Jess, she had already become involved in the situation whether she wanted to be or not, and that refusing to provide truthful information now would not protect her from consequences, but would only mean that the truth would be harder to establish and that Jess and Derek might be able to continue manipulating the narrative to their advantage. Harper looked distressed and said that she had never intended to become involved in such a messy and complicated situation, and that she wished she had refused to provide the first alibi when Jess had initially asked for help, and both Claire and I assured her that we understood she had been manipulated by Jess and had not fully understood what she was agreeing to when she provided the cover stories. After several more minutes of discussion, Harper finally agreed that she would write out a statement describing what Jess had told her about the affair and documenting the specific occasions when she had provided alibis, and she said she would send the statement to both of us via email within the next 2 days. We thanked Harper for her cooperation and for her willingness to tell the truth despite her understandable concerns about the personal and professional consequences, and Claire and I remained at the picnic table after Harper left to discuss how the information she had provided fit into the larger picture of evidence we had both been compiling. Claire said that Harper's account was particularly valuable because it provided an insider's perspective on what Jess had been thinking and feeling during the affair and how Jess had rationalized her behavior, and that having a witness who could testify that Jess had explicitly acknowledged the affair and had described it as emotionally significant would make it much harder for Jess to claim later that the relationship had been innocent or had been mischaracterized by me. I agreed with Claire's assessment, and I also noted that Harper's description of Jess complaining about me being emotionally distant and too focused on work was consistent with what Elena had reported about Jess's comments during their lunch conversation 3 months ago, which suggested that Jess had been telling multiple friends the same narrative about our marriage being unsatisfying in order to justify or explain why she was having an affair. I told Claire that I found this aspect of the situation particularly frustrating because Jess had never expressed any dissatisfaction with our marriage directly to me or suggested that we needed to work on our relationship or seek counseling. And instead, she had apparently been complaining to her friends while maintaining a facade of normalcy at home, which meant I had never had an opportunity to address whatever concerns she might have had before she decided to start an affair. Claire said she had experienced something similar with Derek, who had never told her that he was unhappy in their marriage or that he felt something was missing, and who had in fact been making plans with her for house renovations and vacation trips even while conducting an affair with Jess, which suggested a level of compartmentalization and deception that was deeply disturbing. Claire also mentioned that she had been doing additional research into the charity organization that was hosting the upcoming gala, and that she had discovered that Derek's procurement consulting contract with the charity included specific ethics clauses that prohibited him from using his position to benefit businesses owned by family members or romantic partners, which meant that if Derek had been steering event planning contracts or client referrals to Jess's business, he had violated the terms of his consulting agreement and could potentially face contract termination and professional consequences. I asked Claire if she was planning to report Derek's conduct to the charity board, and she said that she had drafted a formal complaint letter that detailed the affair and the potential conflict of interest issues, but that she was waiting to submit the letter until after she and I had collected all available evidence and witness statements so that the complaint would be as comprehensive and well documented as possible. Claire said that she wanted to submit the complaint approximately 1 week before the charity gala, which would give the board time to review the information and potentially take action before the event, and would also ensure that Derek and Jess would have to face questions and scrutiny from their professional colleagues at a time when many of those colleagues would be gathered in one place. I told Claire that I thought her timing strategy was sound, and I offered to provide her with copies of all the evidence I had collected, including the credit card statements, the lockscreen screenshots, and the witness statements from Rachel, Elena, and Harper, once Harper provided her written account. Claire thanked me for offering to share the complete evidence file, and she said that having access to all of the documentation would strengthen her complaint to the charity board and would make it much more difficult for Derek to dismiss the allegations as exaggerations or misunderstandings, and she also mentioned that she had been reviewing Derek's business calendar and email records that she had access to through their shared home computer, and she had found several instances where Derek had recommended Jess's event planning services to nonprofit clients in language that went beyond what would be appropriate for a casual professional referral, and that suggested a personal investment in promoting Jess's business success. Over the next few days, I continued to refine and organize my evidence documentation, and I received the written statement from Harper via email as she had promised, and her statement was detailed and specific and included direct quotes from conversations she had with Jess about the affair, including Jess's admission that she was in love with Derek and her complaints about her marriage being unsatisfying and routine. I forwarded Harper's statement to Claire and also sent a copy to Michael Reynolds, my divorce attorney, who responded by saying that the accumulation of witness statements and documentary evidence I had compiled created an exceptionally strong case for a fault-based divorce on grounds of adultery, and that he was confident we could negotiate a favorable settlement agreement that would protect my interests and would hold Jess accountable for her breach of the marital commitment. I also received an email from Rachel containing additional information about a conversation she had overheard 6 months ago at a family gathering, where Jess had been talking on her phone in another room, and Rachel had inadvertently heard Jess saying things like, "I miss you too," and "I can't wait until we can be together without hiding," in a tone of voice that was unmistakably romantic and intimate. Rachel said that at the time she had wondered who Jess was talking to and whether there might be someone else in Jess's life, but she had dismissed the thought as unworthy suspicion and had not followed up or investigated further. And now, in retrospect, she realized that conversation had probably been with Derek and had been one of many indicators that she had noticed but rationalized away because she had not wanted to believe that her sister was capable of sustained deception and betrayal. Michael Reynolds called me to schedule a follow-up meeting to discuss the divorce petition that he was preparing to file with the court, and during our phone conversation he mentioned that he had reviewed all of the evidence I had provided and that he recommended we include in the petition a request for an unequal division of marital assets in my favor, based on the documented adultery and the dissipation of marital funds through affair-related expenses. Michael explained that while the affair-related expenses on our credit card were relatively modest in dollar terms, The principle of financial accountability was important and would send a clear message that Jess's behavior had violated not just the emotional commitment of marriage, but also the financial partnership that marriage represents, and that there should be tangible consequences for that violation. I agreed with Michael's recommendation and asked him to proceed with drafting the petition to include a request for an unequal asset division, and I also asked him to include specific language about Jess's use of marital funds to support the affair and about the professional entanglement between the affair and Jess's business relationship with Derek. Michael said he would have a draft petition ready for my review within the next few days, and that once I approved the language, he would file the petition with the court and arrange for Jess to be served with the divorce papers through a professional process server to ensure that the service was properly documented and could not be disputed later. That same evening, I received a series of increasingly angry text messages from Jess demanding that I stop harassing her friends and accusing me of trying to turn everyone against her by spreading lies and exaggerations about what had happened. And she said that if I continued to contact people like Harper and Elena, she would have no choice but to consult with an attorney about getting a restraining order to prevent me from interfering with her professional relationships and damaging her reputation. I did not respond to these text messages because I knew that engaging with Jess's accusations would only escalate the conflict and would not lead to any productive conversation, and I simply saved screenshots of all her messages to my evidence file in case they became relevant later as examples of her attempts to control the narrative and intimidate witnesses. I forwarded the screenshots of Jess's threatening messages to Claire, and she responded by saying that she had received similar messages from Derek accusing her of conspiring with me to destroy his career and his marriage, and that Derek had also threatened to pursue legal action if she went forward with filing a complaint with the charity board about his conflict of interest violations. Claire said that Derek's threatening messages only reinforced her determination to file the complaint and to ensure that he faced professional consequences for his unethical conduct, and she said that she had consulted with her own attorney who had assured her that filing a good faith complaint with a charitable organization's board of directors based on documented evidence was protected activity and could not serve as the basis for a defamation lawsuit or restraining order. 2 days later, I received the draft divorce petition from Michael Reynolds, and I spent several hours reviewing the document carefully to ensure that all of the facts were accurately stated and that the proposed division of assets reflected what I believed to be a fair outcome given the circumstances of Jess's adultery and her breach of the marital commitment. The petition included detailed exhibits documenting the affair through credit card statements, witness statements, and message screenshots, and it requested that the court grant a divorce on grounds of adultery and order an unequal division of marital property that would award me 60% of the equity in the marital home and a larger share of the joint savings and investment accounts. I approved the divorce petition with only minor revisions to clarify a few factual details, and Michael filed the petition with the court the following day and arranged for a process server to deliver the papers to Jess at her office, which was the most reliable location to find her since she was not currently living at our house and I did not know where she was staying. The process server successfully served Jess with the divorce papers 2 days later, and Michael called me to confirm that service had been completed and that Jess now had 30 days to file a response to the petition, either accepting the proposed terms or contesting them and offering alternative proposals for asset division and other aspects of the divorce settlement. Within hours of being served with the divorce papers, Jess called me directly rather than communicating through text messages, and her voice was shaking with a combination of anger and distress as she demanded to know how I could file for divorce without even trying to work on our marriage or giving her a chance to explain everything that had happened and why she had made the choices she had made. I told Jess in a calm and measured tone that she had had 8 months to be honest with me about what was happening and to work on our marriage if she believed there were problems that needed to be addressed, and that she had instead chosen to lie systematically and to conduct a sustained affair while pretending that everything in our marriage was fine, and that I saw no basis for believing that anything she told me now would be more honest or truthful than what she had been saying for the past 8 months. Jess started crying and said that she knew she had made terrible mistakes, but that she loved me and had never stopped loving me, and that the affair with Derek had been a symptom of deeper problems in our marriage that we needed to address together through counseling or therapy. I responded by saying that I did not believe her claim to still love me was genuine or meaningful, given that she had been telling her friends for months that our marriage was boring and unsatisfying, and that Derek made her feel things that I allegedly did not, and I said that her sudden expressions of love and desire for reconciliation seemed more like strategic responses to being caught and facing consequences rather than authentic feelings that had been present all along but unexpressed. Jess became angry and said that I was being cold and unforgiving and that I was not giving her any credit for the 6 years of marriage we had shared before things went wrong, and she said that every marriage goes through difficult periods and that the mature and responsible thing to do would be to work through our problems together rather than immediately jumping to divorce. I told Jess that I might have been willing to consider counseling or reconciliation if she had come to me honestly at some point during the 8 months of the affair, and had admitted what was happening and had expressed genuine remorse and a desire to repair the damage, but that she had never done that and had only started talking about working on our marriage after she was caught, and after I had filed for divorce, which suggested that her primary motivation was avoiding consequences rather than genuinely wanting to repair our relationship. Jess said that I was being unreasonable and vindictive, and that the divorce petition I had filed was clearly designed to punish her financially and to damage her reputation by including detailed descriptions of the affair in a court document that would become part of the public record. And she said that if I really wanted to move forward with a divorce, we should be able to do it in a way that was more private and less focused on assigning blame and creating permanent records of personal failures. I told Jess that I had filed for divorce on grounds of adultery, because that was the factually accurate description of what had happened, and because fault-based divorce grounds were relevant to the division of marital assets under state law, and that if she was concerned about the public nature of court records, she should have considered that possibility before engaging in conduct that provided clear grounds for a fault-based divorce. Our conversation continued in this circular and unproductive pattern for another 10 minutes, with Jess alternating between expressing remorse and demanding that I be more understanding and forgiving, and me maintaining my position that her conduct had destroyed the foundation of trust that marriage requires, and that I had no interest in attempting reconciliation with someone who had proven herself capable of sustained deception and manipulation. Eventually, Jess said that she was going to retain her own attorney, and that I should expect her response to the divorce petition to contest the proposed asset division, and to present a very different account of what had happened in our marriage, and why the relationship had deteriorated to the point where she had made the mistake of getting involved with Derek. I told Jess that she was certainly entitled to retain an attorney and to present whatever account of our marriage she believed to be accurate, but that I had extensive documentation supporting my version of events and multiple witnesses who could corroborate the timeline and nature of her affair, and that her attorney would need to carefully consider the strength of my evidence before advising her to contest the divorce on factual grounds. After we ended the call, I made detailed notes about the conversation and saved them to my evidence file, and I sent a summary of the call to Michael Reynolds so that he would be aware that Jess was planning to contest the divorce petition and would be presenting an alternative narrative about our marriage. The following week, Claire contacted me to say that she had finalized her complaint to the charity board and was planning to submit it the next day, which would be exactly 1 week before the charity gala, and she asked if I would be willing to review the complaint before she submitted it to make sure that she had not included any factual errors or mischaracterizations that might undermine the credibility of her allegations. I agreed to review Claire's complaint to the charity board, and she sent me the document via email later that afternoon, and I spent about an hour reading through the 5-page letter that she had composed with obvious care and attention to detail, laying out the timeline of Derek's affair with Jess, documenting the professional relationship between Derek's procurement consulting role and Jess's event planning business, and presenting evidence that Derek had made at least 4 specific client referrals that had resulted in paid contracts for Jess's company during the period when their affair was ongoing. Claire's complaint included citations to the specific ethics clauses in Derek's consulting contract that prohibited conflicts of interest and required disclosure of any personal relationships that might create the appearance of impropriety in vendor recommendations, and she had attached supporting documentation including Derek's own emails recommending Jess's services to charity clients and describing her as exceptionally talented and highly recommended in language that went beyond what would be typical for a neutral professional referral. I reviewed the complaint carefully and found only 2 minor factual details that needed correction. One regarding the specific date of a client referral that Claire had estimated based on email timestamps, but that I could verify more precisely through credit card records showing when Jess had been paid for that particular event, and another regarding the exact nature of my evidence documentation, which Claire had described as extensive financial records, when in fact I had credit card statements, message screenshots, and witness statements that collectively painted a more complete picture than just financial data alone. I sent Claire my suggested corrections, along with a note saying that her complaint was extremely well written and thoroughly documented, and that I believed it would be very difficult for the charity board to dismiss or ignore the evidence she had presented. Claire submitted her complaint to the charity board the next morning, sending it via email to the board chair and also via certified mail to the charity's main office to ensure that there was a documented record of when the complaint was received and by whom. She copied me on the email submission, and within hours she received an automated response from the board chair acknowledging receipt of her complaint and indicating that it would be reviewed by the board's ethics committee and that she would receive a response within 10 business days regarding what action, if any, the board planned to take. Claire forwarded me this acknowledgement and added a note saying that she was satisfied that the complaint was now in the official record and that regardless of what action the board ultimately decided to take, Derek would have to answer questions about his conduct and would face scrutiny from his professional colleagues at a time when his reputation and his business relationships were already under stress from the public exposure of his affair. Over the next few days, I continued my regular work at the fire station while also monitoring developments in the divorce case and staying in communication with Claire about the charity board's review of her complaint. I received a formal response to my divorce petition from Jess's attorney, a lawyer named Patricia Henshaw who had a reputation for being aggressive and uncompromising in divorce cases, and Patricia's response contested nearly every aspect of my proposed settlement, including the unequal division of assets, the characterization of Jess's conduct as adultery warranting fault-based grounds, and even some of the basic factual claims about the timeline and nature of the affair. Patricia's response included a counter-narrative that portrayed Jess as someone who had been emotionally neglected in her marriage and who had formed a close friendship with Derek that had unfortunately crossed boundaries into something more intimate, but that this boundary crossing had been a relatively recent development and had been motivated by genuine emotional needs rather than by any desire to deceive or betray me. I read through Patricia's response with a mixture of frustration and dark amusement. Frustration because I knew that Jess and her attorney were preparing to wage a public relations battle in addition to a legal one, and dark amusement because the counter-narrative Patricia had constructed was so clearly contradicted by the extensive evidence I had compiled that I could not imagine how they planned to maintain this version of events once depositions and discovery proceedings forced them to confront the documented timeline and witness statements. I forwarded Patricia's response to Michael Reynolds, along with a note asking how we should respond to the factual distortions and mischaracterizations it contained, and Michael replied saying that we would address each of Patricia's claims systematically in our rebuttal and that we would attach additional evidence exhibits that would make it clear to the court that Jess's version of events was not supported by the documentary record. 2 days before the charity gala, Claire received a phone call from the board chair of the charity organization asking if she would be willing to meet with the ethics committee to discuss her complaint in more detail and to answer questions about the evidence she had provided. Claire agreed to the meeting and asked if she could bring documentation to support her allegations, and the board chair said that would be appropriate and that the committee would be meeting the following afternoon in a conference room at the charity's main office. Claire immediately called me after ending her conversation with the board chair, and she asked if I would be willing to attend the ethics committee meeting with her as a supporting witness who could corroborate the affair timeline and could provide additional evidence that she had not included in her original complaint. I told Claire that I would be happy to attend the meeting and to provide whatever testimony or documentation the ethics committee needed to understand the full scope of Derek's conduct. And Claire said she would inform the board chair that she would be bringing a witness and would request that the meeting be scheduled for a time when I could be available. The board chair agreed to this arrangement, and the meeting was scheduled for 4 o'clock the following afternoon, which gave Claire and me about 24 hours to prepare our presentation and to organize the evidence we wanted to share with the committee. Claire and I met for coffee the evening before the ethics committee meeting to coordinate our approach and to make sure we had consistent and complementary accounts of what had happened and when, and we spent 2 hours reviewing the complete evidence file and creating a chronological presentation that would walk the committee through the 8-month affair from its beginning at the alumni fundraiser through the public exposure at my house party. We divided the presentation into sections, with Claire focusing on the professional conflict of interest issues and Derek's breach of his consulting contract ethics clauses, and me focusing on the personal deception and the systematic cover stories that both Derek and Jess had maintained to hide their affair from their respective spouses. The next afternoon, Claire and I arrived at the charity's main office 15 minutes early for our meeting with the ethics committee, and we were shown to a conference room where 3 board members were already seated around a large table with copies of Claire's complaint and various other documents spread out in front of them. The board chair introduced himself as Martin Hendricks and introduced the other 2 committee members as Susan Park and James Donnelly. And Martin explained that the committee had reviewed Claire's complaint carefully and had some questions about the specific allegations regarding Derek's client referrals to Jess's event planning business, and about whether those referrals had been made in violation of the conflict of interest provisions in Derek's consulting contract. Claire began by providing an overview of how she had discovered Derek's affair with Jess and how that discovery had led her to investigate whether there were professional entanglements that went beyond the personal relationship, and she presented copies of Derek's emails to charity clients recommending Jess's services, along with documentation showing that at least 4 of those recommendations had resulted in paid contracts for Jess's company during the period when the affair was active. Susan Park asked whether Claire had any evidence that Derek had disclosed his personal relationship with Jess to the charity board or to the clients he was recommending her to, and Claire responded that she had found no evidence of any such disclosure in Derek's emails or in his communications with the board, and that in fact Derek's emails presented Jess as simply a qualified professional vendor rather than as someone with whom he had a personal relationship. James Donnelly asked me to describe what evidence I had regarding the timeline of the affair and whether I could verify that Derek and Jess had been romantically involved during the period when the client referrals were being made, and I presented the credit card statements showing hotel charges and restaurant bills corresponding to the dates of the referral emails that Claire had provided, and I also showed the committee-selected lockscreen message screenshots that demonstrated the romantic nature of Derek and Jess's relationship and the fact that they were coordinating their schedules to meet secretly on a regular basis. Martin Hendricks asked whether I had any direct evidence that Derek had discussed business matters or client referrals with Jess during their meetings, and I acknowledged that I did not have direct evidence of the specific content of their conversations, but that the temporal correlation between their meetings and the subsequent client referrals was highly suggestive of a professional relationship that was entangled with their personal affair. The committee members conferred quietly among themselves for a few minutes, and then Martin said that based on the evidence Claire and I had presented, the committee was inclined to find that Derek had violated the ethics clauses in his consulting contract by failing to disclose his personal relationship with Jess. At the time, he was making vendor recommendations that benefited her business, and that this violation warranted serious consequences, including potential termination of his consulting contract and removal from his position on the charity's vendor selection committee. Martin also said that the committee would need to interview Derek directly to give him an opportunity to respond to the allegations before making a final determination, but that the evidence was sufficiently strong that they were prepared to take immediate interim action by suspending Derek from his vendor selection duties pending the outcome of the investigation. Claire asked whether the committee's findings would be made public or would be communicated to the charity's donor, community, and stakeholders, and Martin said that the committee would issue a statement indicating that Derek had been suspended pending an ethics investigation, but would not include detailed allegations in that public statement, and that if the investigation resulted in contract termination, the charity would issue a more detailed explanation at that time. Susan Park added that the charity gala scheduled for the following evening would proceed as planned, but that Derek would not be participating in his usual role as a host or sponsor recognition speaker, and that if he chose to attend as a general guest, he would be expected to maintain a low profile and would not be given any platform or official acknowledgement. After the ethics committee meeting concluded, Claire and I walked out to the parking lot together, and she said that she felt a sense of vindication and relief that the committee had taken her complaint seriously and had been willing to act on the evidence rather than dismissing it as a private marital dispute that was not relevant to Derek's professional conduct. I told Claire that I shared her sense of satisfaction and that I believed the committee's decision to suspend Derek and to investigate his conduct sent an important message that professional ethics standards applied regardless of personal relationships or social status, and that people in positions of authority and influence could not use those positions to benefit their romantic partners without facing consequences. Claire mentioned that she had decided to attend the charity gala the following evening, despite the awkwardness and discomfort that would inevitably result from her presence at an event where Derek would also be present and where many attendees would be aware of the affair and the ethics investigation, and she asked if I would consider attending with her as a show of solidarity and mutual support. I hesitated because I had not originally planned to attend the gala, and because I knew that my presence would likely escalate the social tension and would make it impossible for either Derek or Jess to maintain any pretense of normalcy. But after thinking about it for a moment, I told Claire that I would attend with her because I believed that both Derek and Jess needed to face public accountability for their conduct. In a setting where their professional colleagues and social contacts would be able to observe their reactions and draw their own conclusions. Claire thanked me for agreeing to attend and said that she thought our presence together at the gala would make a powerful statement. The evening of the charity gala arrived, and I met Claire in the hotel lobby where the event was being held, and we walked together into the grand ballroom that had been decorated with elaborate floral arrangements and ambient lighting that created an atmosphere of elegance and celebration that seemed ironically incongruous with the confrontation that was about to unfold. We immediately noticed that many of the attendees were watching us with obvious curiosity and interest, and I could see people whispering to each other and gesturing discreetly in our direction as they recognized both of us and understood the significance of our arrival together at an event where Derek and Jess were also expected to be present. Within minutes of our arrival, I spotted Jess standing near the bar, talking with a small group of alumni network colleagues, and I watched as someone in her group noticed Claire and me and said something to Jess that caused her to turn and look directly at us, and her face went pale and her expression shifted from relaxed social engagement to visible distress as she realized that we were not only attending the gala but were attending together as a unified front that represented the consequences of our actions. Derek appeared moments later from another entrance to the ballroom, and he stopped abruptly when he saw Claire and me standing together near the registration table, and I could see him calculating whether to approach us, or to avoid us, or to simply leave the event entirely. Before either Derek or Jess could decide how to respond, Martin Hendricks stepped to the podium at the front of the ballroom and called for everyone's attention to begin the evening's formal program and recognition of sponsors and donors.